Hello, thank you so much for tuning into my YouTube channel. In today's video, I want to talk about the color spaces and their importance in imaging science. My focus will be sRGB, Adobe RGB, and ProPhoto RGB. Let's get started. As I said in this video, I want to talk about color spaces and their importance in imaging. A color space is a specific organization of colors often represented in a 3D model using coordinates that define how colors mix to create all possible hues, shades, and tints. Each color space has its own range or gamut of colors that it can represent. These color spaces are crucial for ensuring accurate color reproduction in different devices, monitors, printers, and cameras, and applications such as web, print, and video. The term color gamut refers to the range of colors that a specific color space can display. A broader gamut allows for more vibrant, saturated, or real colors. A color outside of a particular gamut cannot be accurately represented in that color space and may appear less saturated or shifted in hue. The more limited the gamut, the fewer colors the space can represent, and vice versa. The color gamut is shown in a color space, usually a visually uniform one, like CLAP. Here we are using CIEXYZ. The gamut is usually compared with the spectrum locus, which contains the colors visible to human beings. This is the spectrum locus, the horseshoe shape. The closer a color to the spectrum locus, the more saturated it is, and the closer a color to the center of the spectrum locus, the less saturated it is. So the closer color is here to the edge of the spectrum locus, the more saturated. And the closer the color to the center of the spectrum locus, the less saturated it is. You could see here that some of the color spaces are very close to the edges of the spectrum locus, enabling them to reproduce very saturated colors, whereas some of them are not the same, making them unable to reproduce very saturated colors, and very saturated colors will be reproduced as very dull. So these are the primaries. This one, and this one. And this one, and this one, and also this one, and this one. The closer these primaries to the edges of the spectrum locus, the more saturated colors could be reproduced in that color space. Now let's talk about sRGB, Adobe RGB, and ProPhoto RGB color spaces. Let's start with sRGB. sRGB is the most widely used color space for web content, standard monitors, and consumer-level imaging. It's considered the default color space for most digital content. sRGB has a relatively small color gamut, focusing on colors that can be displayed on most consumer-grade devices such as standard monitors. sRGB uses a set of red, green, and blue primaries defined in terms of chromaticity coordinates. The gamma value for sRGB is roughly 2.2. The gamma value determines the relationship between a pixel's numeric value and its luminance. Since sRGB is optimized for average consumer displays, it cannot represent very saturated colors like certain deep blues, greens, and reds. For example, vibrant colors in photographs might look less saturated or muted in sRGB. Adobe RGB is often used in professional photography, printing, and graphic design where more color accuracy is required, especially in print workflows. Adobe RGB has a larger gamut than sRGB, particularly in the green and cyan regions. This makes it ideal for work where color precision is important. The primaries of Adobe RGB are designed to include a wider range of colors that are typically found in professional printing. Adobe RGB has a gamma value of 2.2, but its color reproduction extends beyond what sRGB can achieve, particularly in cyan and green tones. Although Adobe RGB covers more colors than sRGB, it still cannot capture every hue that exists in the visible spectrum, and there are even wider color spaces like ProPhoto RGB for tasks that require extreme color precision. ProPhoto RGB is used in high-end photography and image editing where every possible hue in a digital photograph must be preserved. It is often used in raw photo editing. ProPhoto RGB has an extremely large gamut, even encompassing colors that human eye cannot perceive. This ensures that almost every visible color can be represented, making it ideal for preserving detail in high-quality photography or scientific imaging. The primaries for ProPhoto RGB covers an exceptionally wide range, even beyond visible color in some cases. This ensures that no significant color data is lost during editing, especially in raw formats. It has a gamma value of 1.8. ProPhoto RGB's gamut is so large that it includes non-visible colors, which can lead to issues when converting images to other formats like sRGB or printing them. Careful color management is required to avoid color banding or clipping. Here are the key differences between sRGB, Adobe RGB, and ProPhoto RGB. In practical terms, choosing the right color space depends on the task at hand. For web-based projects, sRGB is sufficient, but for high-quality printing or advanced photo editing, Adobe RGB or ProPhoto RGB are better suited. In this video, I intend to show you the difference between these color spaces using simulation in MATLAB. To show the difference between sRGB, Adobe RGB, and ProPhoto RGB effectively, the colors should be highly saturated, especially in regions where sRGB is known to struggle. The colors chosen are saturated cyan, purple, red, blue, and green. Highly saturated colors tend to suffer in sRGB due to its much smaller gamut as opposed to Adobe RGB and ProPhoto RGB color spaces. I will show you this difference with a simple simulation in MATLAB. You have to note that due to most displays following sRGB, it would be hard to show the difference between these color spaces. So in my simulation, I artificially desaturated highly saturated colors just to show you what happens to the highly saturated colors in sRGB as opposed to Adobe RGB and ProPhoto RGB. Also, a MATLAB code will show you the color gamuts of these color spaces in 3D domain as well. The gamuts are visualized in CLab color space, a color space where distances between colors are perceptually uniform. This means the size and shape of each gamut will correspond more closely to how different the colors will actually appear to the human eye. We'll compare the coverage of each color space in this 3D space. Let's go to MATLAB then. Okay, here's the first code. This is going to be the image size, and then I'm going to be defining the highly saturated colors here: purple, cyan, green, red, and blue. And then I'm going to try to simulate them in the sRGB, Adobe RGB, and ProPhoto RGB. I'm going to also calculate the difference between sRGB and Adobe RGB. And I'm going to compress the sRGB just to accentuate the desaturation process that's done in sRGB when the highly saturated colors are going to be represented there. So this is where I'm going to be making each color in part of the image, and then this is where the extreme desaturation process is going to be applied to sRGB. So if the color is out of gamut, I'm going to be reducing the saturation drastically as shown here, and for a more dramatic impact, I'm going to convert them to grayscale as well. But for Adobe RGB and ProPhoto RGB, I'm not going to do any clipping so that the colors would appear more saturated. So extreme desaturation process is going to be applied to sRGB, but it's not going to be applied to Adobe RGB and ProPhoto RGB. And I'm going to be calculating the difference between sRGB and Adobe RGB here. And I'm going to show you all the images here along with the difference between Adobe RGB and sRGB. And you would see that the sRGB has been a little bit desaturated. Again, I have accentuated the difference just for the sake of simulation, just to show you what happens to the highly saturated colors in sRGB. Let's run it. So this is what happened to the sRGB and Adobe RGB and ProPhoto RGB. They're fine. And this is the difference between Adobe RGB and sRGB. So if it's out of the gamut in sRGB, they're going to be desaturated. Again, I'm accentuating the process just to show you what happens in sRGB. Now let's go to the second code where I'm going to be plotting the color gamuts of sRGB, Adobe RGB, and ProPhoto RGB in CLab color space. As you can see, we start with different values of RGB because after all these color spaces have RGB primaries. But the only difference between them is where they are located with respect to the spectrum locus. For Adobe RGB and ProPhoto RGB, these RGB primaries are more saturated. But for sRGB, especially the G primary, is not as saturated. So we start with RGB, and then we turn them into XYZ, and then we turn them into CLab, and then we reshape them to a 3D grid for plotting, and then we extract the LAB components, and then we just plot them using scatter3, and we're going to be plotting them on the same plot. I'm going to also show you guys the convex hull for sRGB and Adobe RGB and ProPhoto RGB. You could access these codes using the link in the description section of this video as well. So let's run this one, see what happens. You could see that the red one is sRGB, the green one is Adobe RGB, and the blue one is ProPhoto RGB. You could obviously see that the ProPhoto RGB encompasses a lot more colors as opposed to sRGB and Adobe RGB. Again, you could access this code using the link in the description section of my video. And that's about it. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you liked it and you were able to get something out of it. If you liked it, I would appreciate it if you could subscribe to my channel and also share the video with your friends. Thank you so much and have a nice day.